In the last video, we talked about the first part of the definition of relevance. Now let's look at the second part of the definition, Part B of Federal Rule of Evidence 401. And Part B of 401 says that the fact must be of consequence in determining the action. It must be of consequence. So for evidence to be relevant, it can't just have a tendency to make any fact more or less probable. The fact has to be of consequence. It has to be related to the cause of action. In other words, whatever fact the evidence is trying to prove or disprove has to actually matter to somebody who's trying to decide the case. If it doesn't matter, it isn't relevant. So I've left up a couple of drawings from the previous video so we can keep using them as examples. All right, so let's say that in our bank robbery trial, one of the parties wants to offer evidence that say the defendant owns 6 cats. All right, so here's my artist's rendition of cats, and the prosecution wants to introduce evidence that the defendant owns 6 cats. All right, well, that might tend to show that he's more of a cat person than a dog person, but it doesn't matter at all to whether he might have robbed the bank, right? It's not a fact that's of consequence in determining the action. So pretty clearly, this is a fact that's just not relevant. All right, now on the other hand, both the hospital record and the testimony about the white car, those relate to whether the defendant might have been near the scene of the crime. And of course, whether he was there is a fact of consequence because it relates to whether he actually might have been the one who committed the robbery. And then there's the bit, the evidence about the witness being legally blind. Well, whether the witness is legally blind, that's a fact of consequence too, because it relates to whether the getaway vehicle really was a white car. And that in turn relates to whether the defendant might have been the robber. Now, of course, whether the witness is legally blind, that's only a fact of consequence if the witness first testifies that she saw a white car. If she hasn't testified that she saw something, well, then it doesn't matter whether she's legally blind. But if the prosecution introduces her testimony, that she saw something, right? That she saw a white car. If the prosecution introduces her testimony about what she saw, well then, whether she's even able to see, well, that becomes fair game. It becomes a fact of consequence. In that case, we say that the prosecution has opened the door. It has opened the door to evidence about the witness's ability to see. Not open to, opened the door. All right. Now, what we need to realize about all this of consequence stuff, we have to realize that whether a fact is of consequence, it depends on the case. Right? We have to do a case-by-case determination. All right. So, what is this case-by-case determination going to depend on? Well, one of the things it might depend on is the elements of the claim. What are the elements of the claim in that case? So, for example, if we were trying to determine whether a defendant is guilty of a general intent crime, well then whether the defendant had specific intent, that's not a fact of consequence, because specific intent is not an element of a general intent crime. Okay, so in our case-by-case determination, we have to understand what the elements of the claim actually are. Understanding the elements of the claim is going to be very, very important here. Next, are there any affirmative defenses? All right, so let's use a different example here. Let's say that we have a case about a contract for a sale of land. Well, for a contract case, right, for a contract for a sale of land, the statute of frauds applies. So whether there was anything in writing, that's going to be a fact of consequence. But in our robbery example here, whether or not there was a writing of any kind, that just doesn't matter. Okay, so that's not going to be something that's relevant. Next, has one side opened the door? Has one side opened the door to evidence about certain things? And we've already talked about an example of this. Okay, so all of these things will dictate whether a particular fact is of consequence in that case. So to figure out whether a fact is of consequence in a particular case, we need to think about whether the fact would actually matter to the outcome of that case. All right, now before we end this video, just 2 wrinkles in this rule of evidence that I want to point out. All right, and let's write them down. I'll just call them wrinkles. And there are 2 of them. Well, I should start with number one. Okay, the first wrinkle here. The first one is that whether or not the parties dispute the truth of some fact, that actually has no effect on whether evidence about that fact is relevant. So here's what I mean. Even if one side concedes, if it admits that a particular fact is true, that doesn't mean that evidence about that fact is not relevant. All right, so say, for example, that the defendant, in our bank robbery case, all right, let's say he concedes that he was in debt, and so he did have a possible motive to commit the crime. Well, that doesn't mean that any evidence about the defendant's debt is irrelevant. You might think the evidence is unnecessary since the defendant already admitted that he was in debt, but unnecessary does not mean irrelevant. And actually, the prosecution might have a very good reason for still wanting to introduce that evidence. After all, it's one thing to admit that you're in debt and need money. But a lot of people are in debt, and we don't really assume that they're therefore going to go out and rob a bank. But if there's evidence that the defendant owed $1 million in gambling debts, and he owed those debts to some very scary loan sharks who threatened to break his kneecaps if he didn't pay them, well, that paints a very different picture, doesn't it? Right? Okay, but regardless, the point is this. Evidence is not irrelevant just because it relates to something that's been conceded. All right? So conceded fact, the fact that something is conceded doesn't matter. The fact that a fact is conceded, it doesn't matter whether evidence about that fact, it's not going to affect whether evidence about that fact is relevant. All right, so that's the first wrinkle. The second wrinkle is this. Sometimes a piece of evidence can possibly be relevant for multiple purposes. And that's important to know. Well, let's write that down. Multiple purposes. Even if the evidence ends up being inadmissible for one purpose, it might be admissible for another purpose. Okay, so a piece of evidence might be relevant for multiple purposes, and one of those purposes might end up being inadmissible. The evidence might be inadmissible for that purpose, but it might still be admissible for another purpose. Okay, so we need to understand that there may be multiple purposes in play. Here's an example. And as we're going to learn in some later videos, evidence that a defendant has done something bad in the past, okay, that he's committed some wrong or some crime in the past, that evidence usually cannot be used to try to prove that he committed some other wrong later. And there are some exceptions to this, but in general, the rules of evidence don't allow it. And that's probably a good thing, because who hasn't done something wrong in the past, right? And if the fact that you've done something wrong in the past can be used to prove that you therefore did some other bad thing later, well, then we'd all be in trouble. Okay, so let's say that in our bank robbery case, the prosecution tries to introduce evidence that the defendant had been involved in some underground illegal gambling ring. All right, so he was a gambling guy. Okay, so here's some cards here, just to show that he was a gambling guy. Okay, so king, queen, jack. All right, so that's a pretty bad drawing, but you get the idea. Okay, so he was a gambling guy, and if the prosecution were to try to introduce evidence that he had done some illegal gambling in the past, well, then the defendant would probably object to that evidence, and the defendant would say, "Hey, you can't use evidence of my past wrongdoings to try to prove that I did something wrong here. I mean, okay, so I did some illegal gambling in the past. That doesn't mean I'm a bank robber, right?" And actually, the defendant would be right. The defendant would be right. Just because you've done some illegal gambling in the past, that doesn't mean that you're a bank robber. But if the prosecutor is clever, he or she can point out that the evidence is actually relevant for multiple purposes. It isn't just relevant to show that the defendant is, generally a shady criminal type. I mean, we already said that that's not admissible. That it's not admissible as evidence that he committed the robbery. But it's also relevant for another thing, right? It also supports the prosecution's theory that he had a lot of gambling debt, and so he had a motive to commit the robbery. Okay, so you see, the evidence can sometimes prove more than just one fact, and even if the evidence is inadmissible for one purpose, it might be admissible for another purpose. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the evidence being offered to prove? Right? That's what we have to always be asking ourselves when we're trying to determine whether a piece of evidence is relevant. And as I said before, a smart lawyer who wants to introduce a piece of evidence will always be thinking, okay, if the other side objects to my evidence and says that it's inadmissible to try to prove something, is it possible that the evidence might be admissible for some other purpose, right? To try to prove some other fact. Okay, so let's review. For evidence to be relevant, it can't just have a tendency to make any fact more or less probable. The fact has to be of consequence. It has to actually matter to the case. And whether a fact matters is a case-by-case determination. We have to look at things like the elements of the claim, whether there are any applicable defenses, and whether the other side has opened the door to evidence about certain things. And whether a fact is conceded or admitted by one side, that doesn't make evidence about that fact irrelevant. The other side can still choose to introduce evidence about the fact, as long as the fact is of consequence, of course. And evidence can be relevant for multiple purposes. So even if the evidence is inadmissible for one purpose, it might be admissible for another purpose. And a smart lawyer will always be thinking about all of the possible different ways in which a piece of evidence might be relevant.